The program will begin shortly. The program will begin shortly. And now, Elliot Gerson of the Aspen Institute.
Good afternoon, good evening. Wasn't that amazing? Special thanks to the artists, Nadia Hironaka and Matthew Sub, for that clip from their film Field Companion, which was filmed entirely within a mirror-lined terrarium that they had designed themselves. So absolutely remarkable. We hope that you have been enjoying your last 24 hours plus. It is so exciting for the Aspen Institute to be engaged in this. When Mayor Gelber and I first talked about this almost exactly a year ago, we had in mind an audience precisely like the one that has been enjoying all of these programs over the last day and a half. Young, diverse, smart, passionate, inclusive, ambitious, and thirsty for solutions. So it is so exciting for us to see how it has developed. We knew that Miami, already a significant global hub of culture and commerce, could be an ideal partner for us to bring our ideas brand away from Colorado and to a location specifically to focus deeply on one of the most important issues any of us ever will face. And all we had to do was combine that idea and vision that the mayor had with the dedication of teams at Aspen, Kitty Boone and her ideas team, and also Greg Gershuni and his climate and energy team, and voila. And we thank all of you for participating in it. And of course, we can't thank again, or too much, our partners and sponsors for making this possible. So in this next plenary session, we're going to have Helen Mountford sharing how we can truly decarbonize the shipping industry. Then the CEO of Florida Power and Light will expand on the challenges of bringing different technologies into the grid, like ground-based solar and green hydrogen, but why those challenges are essential for us to meet. Anthony Leiserowitz of the Yale Program on Climate is going to show us some takeaways from the incredibly fascinating recent data that he has analyzed about what America really thinks about climate change and how we can reach everybody. After that, Barton Seaver, chef extraordinaire, and Jennifer Morrison, CEO of the Nature Conservancy, will talk about our relationship with the ocean that feeds us. And finally, we'll hear from some of our country's leading environmental justice experts on why the climate movement must protect the planet, and of course, all of us as well. Thank you very much, and enjoy.
And now, Helen Mountford.
Hello, great to see you all here and online here in Miami. I'm Helen Mountford. I'm president and CEO of ClimateWorks Foundation. We work to help amplify the impact of climate philanthropy, helping to get more money to the field to tackle the big climate challenges more quickly. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about shipping and what we can do on shipping. Shipping is the lifeblood of the global economy. Up to 90% of global trade is carried on ships. But shipping also has massive impacts on human health and on the planet. Today's ships rely very heavily on fossil fuels, with most using bottom-of-the-barrel heavy fuel oil, particularly polluting. As a result, the sector produces about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. If shipping were a country, it'd be the 6th largest greenhouse gas emitter. Just as an example, Carnival Corporation's cruise ships operating in European waters produce 10 times more sulfur pollution than all of Europe's 260 million cars. 10 times more just from those cruise ships compared to all the cars. So any pathway to a climate-safe future really needs shipping the sector to peak emissions soon and to reach net zero, zero carbon by 2050. And while we've got some very promising pilot projects, we need to do more and urgently for the industry to get onto the right track. The good news is it can be done. If we shift just 5% of ships to new clean fuels by 2030, we could put the whole industry on a growth curve to achieve 100% zero carbon ships by 2050. But we need to start now. First slide, please. So there is some good news. There's some promising news in this sector. Although shipping has traditionally been a very slow to move industry, a very hard to move industry, it's an industry that is concentrated with just a few big power players. And that means there's some opportunity here. Just 10 companies control more than 90% of the worldwide container market. That includes Maersk, MSC, Costco, names that are familiar to so many of you. And major retailers like Walmart, Target, and Amazon use these companies for their shipping needs. So with leadership from just a few of these leading shipping cargo owners and these major retailers, the industry's concentration could actually enable it to be the factor which can help it to shift quickly. We just need a few to step up and have leadership. And the good news is we've got a few who are moving. So let me highlight an example from Maersk. Maersk has a strong commitment to net zero emissions. It's responsible for over 1 in 6 container ships globally. In 2018, their CEO committed that all their shipping would be net zero by 2050. At that time, they had no idea how they were going to actually really achieve this, but they knew with that significant market share, if they actually put this target in place, shipbuilders and fuel producers would actually find the solutions to help get them there. That market share is so important, and it's working. With progress in the sector already, Maersk has since brought forward its net zero emissions target to 2040 and has set milestone 2030 target, so it's making improvements. Amazon is another emerging leader in this space. As co-founder of the Climate Pledge and with a goal to deliver 50% of Amazon shipments with net zero carbon by 2030. So we need more bold action from just a few players like this, big industry leaders, to really tip the shipping industry to green. And then what we can do is consolidate that through the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, which is where governments come together to agree common rules for the shipping sector. So let me highlight just 5 specific levers that can help us to move on this trajectory. First, establish green corridors to show how goods can be moved without fossil fuels. Just a few initial shipping routes that run on zero-emission fuels, catalyzed by favorable market and policy conditions, can demonstrate how to reach that 5% by 2030 goal. So green corridors have already been announced from Los Angeles to Shanghai, which is one of the world's busiest container routes, and Australia to East Asia, where mining companies have joined with shipping lines to create an iron ore transport route that's going to be using ammonia-powered vessels. So we've got some examples, we need a few more there. Second point, price carbon to stop subsidizing fossil fuel pollution. That's a popular one. Glad to hear there's support here. Governments have often completely exempted shipping from carbon pricing and from any fuel taxes. This has got to stop now. They should also set mandatory standards for zero carbon fuels and shipping and reduced air pollution as the industry starts to gain confidence with the new technologies and approaches. So there's a lot there that governments can do on setting the emissions targets and the regulations. Third, leverage and scale collaboration among cargo owners, shippers, ports, fuel producers, and policymakers. So initiatives like Aspen Institute's Cargo Owners for Zero Emission Vessels sends an absolutely vital signal from ship owners to the maritime value chain and bunker fuel producers that they expect and want the industry to move faster towards these solutions. The Climate Emergency Shipping Coalition is another one which brings together stakeholders and analysts to identify some of the solutions that can decarbonize shipping, working across technology, policy, and industry. From the Climate Works Foundation side, we're really happy to be supporting both of these initiatives in finding the solutions and moving forward. And this work has been made possible by grants from the Bezos Earth Fund, and their giving has now inspired others. So there are more coming into this field to actually support these important coalitions which can help drive the action and build the leaders we need. Next slide, thank you. Fourth point, we need to avoid being hoodwinked by the fossil fuel lobby. There is a strong push now to replace heavy shipping oil with gas as a fuel. But when you consider the full life cycle of liquefied natural gas, including significant leakage, as you can see in this photo here, gas is not the solution we need. This is particularly, that's popular too? Good. This is particularly true as we see the consequences of a Russian war in Ukraine that is being financed by our addiction to fossil fuels. Now is not the moment to create more demand for gas. And fifth, absolutely essential, is to support a just transition. Because shipping is fundamental to local economies and the world, and with so much importance on port communities, employing so many people, there are social and justice implications to the transition, and we need to ensure these are taken into consideration and local communities involved in the decisions and the planning for the transition. With these 5 levers and leadership from a few of the cargo ship owners, the shipping container companies, and retailers, just a few leaders in this space, we can really tip the shipping sector to green. It's been a sector that has been ignored for far too long, who has enormous emissions, and they're growing. We have the solutions, we need the leaders, and it's time to move. So please join us. Thank you.
And now, Silagy with Amy Harder of Cipher.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Amy Harder. I'm executive editor of Cipher. It's a new publication by Breakthrough Energy, where we are covering the technological transformations that we need to reach net zero, which includes a huge part of the electricity sector. At Cipher, we have a saying where we say energy is something we never notice until it's gone or expensive. And Eric's job is to make sure neither of those things happen. As CEO of Florida Power and Light, his company is responsible for keeping the lights on today and all over Florida. And so it's just so important that, of course, first and foremost, electricity is both affordable and reliable, but electricity companies are now beginning to have a third mandate, and that's to provide clean electricity. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you, Eric, about everything from solar to tariffs to natural gas and green hydrogen. So thank you so much for being with us here today. So my first question, I want to just kind of give the lay of the land for those of us in the audience today. So FPL is a big provider of solar energy, but your electricity mix is majority, I think about 73% natural gas.
About 70, yeah.
Can you talk about, and that's fluctuated over the years, and I know your goal is to decrease that. Can you talk about why natural gas is still a big part of your electricity mix and how you hope to decrease that in the coming years?
Sure. So first off, it's great to be with all of you. You know, it's been an interesting journey for us. If you go back in time and look at how FPL's energy mix has changed, it's been very significant over the course of the last several decades, particularly. If you go back to 2001, we actually burned more oil than any utility in America to generate electricity. A large part of that was because of the geography of Florida. We didn't have pipelines, and we had limitation. It was either going to be oil or coal of what else we could actually generate electricity with. So the company made a decision actually in the late 90s to start to wean itself off of foreign oil and switch to natural gas, which is significantly cleaner from an emissions profile, but also had a much better prediction from a volatility on pricing standpoint, and gave us the ability to start deploying new technologies which are much more fuel efficient. So we were burning less fossil fuel to produce electricity. And we also have to meet the demands of a growing state. Florida continues to add about 1,000 people a day, and has for a number of years. So we have a lot of demand as well that we have to be able to meet, and we've been growing for decades in this state. Fast forward to today, and we're a utility that, in 2001 burned 41 million barrels of oil to generate electricity. It's a utility that burns no oil. In fact, we only burned a little bit of low sulfur diesel last year because we're required to burn it to prove that we can burn it in case we have to for an emergency. And we switched to natural gas, and that switch enabled us also to burn a lot less of the fuel. We're on average 35 to 40% more fuel efficient than we were just 20 years ago, which means we're burning a lot less of that. Now we've also expanded into other technologies like solar. 20% of our fleet is nuclear powered. And our big goal now is to continue to expand solar from what is relatively a small percentage, and we are the largest utility in America from a standpoint of both customers as well as the amount of electricity that we produce and the amount of electricity that our customers use, to a company that's going to provide more and more of it from solar. So we announced about 5 years ago that we were going to install 30 million panels by 2030. We've actually done more than 50% of that already, and we're 5 years ahead of schedule.
Sounds like you need to increase your goal.
My goal is to add...
You can do that right here.
And we absolutely are committed to going beyond. That was just an initial goal that was audacious, more than anybody in the world, from any one electric utility standpoint. But it's just the beginning. Look, our first solar plant was installed in 1984, here in Miami, actually. It was tiny.
Is it still there?
Yeah, it was experimental, and we have the experimental panels still up. They're not doing too well, they're old.
1984 is not that
84. Yeah, you're telling me.
You're definitely over 30.
But, I tell you that because it was a great experiment, but it was really expensive. And so for us, we're really focused on trying to make sure that our customers continue to have both affordable and it has to be reliable power, as well as adopting new technology and being willing to embrace change. So that's what's really hard for a lot of folks in our industry, is to embrace the change that comes with it, but do it driven in economics so people can afford to actually embrace that change.
So we heard from the previous speaker, there were some cheers when there was a comment about natural gas being a fossil fuel and something that we shouldn't continue to be dependent upon. What do you say to people who do view natural gas as a fossil fuel, and of course it is, and continuing to be dependent upon it and increasing dependence on that is not going to help us get to our climate goals? So how is FPL working to decrease the amount of natural gas in your mix?
So we're not increasing our natural gas.
Are you decreasing?
We are if we can get green hydrogen to work. I don't want to just go into another fossil fuel. And building a new nuclear plant doesn't work, unfortunately, even though I'm a fan of the fact that it is zero carbon around the clock. We are building a lot of solar, which is terrific. But the reality is it doesn't work real well at night. And we still have air conditioning used at night, and people are going to be streaming at night and watching this, hopefully, if they can't join us today. And so we're pairing our solar with battery storage, as an example. Matter of fact, we just commissioned the world's largest battery storage facility powered by a solar facility. It's a 40-acre battery.
And where is that?
It's in Manatee County, right next to an existing solar facility. It's the equivalent of 100 million iPhones in power.
Maybe there can be a tour at the next Aspen conference.
Absolutely. We'd love to take people through.
The Aspen folks are listening.
But we've also done battery projects here in Miami, and we've done battery projects across the state. And part of this is, again, how do you couple all of these different technologies, not get married to any one, but recognize that a smart portfolio of assets, one that people can rely on, is going to end up being just that, a portfolio of assets. Now, what I've really focused on is how can we take frankly, our dirtiest facilities and retire them. So our oil has been retired. We used to buy power from contracts from 2 coal plants, as an example. We bought those contracts out and tore those plants down. They are no longer in existence. And that saved customers money, by the way, also because coal is more expensive here in Florida. And matter of fact, we're building a solar plant on top of the remains of the last coal plant we tore down. And we're doing it, thank you. We're doing it because it's not only the right thing to do for future generations being clean, but also it's economic. Look, I want to be clear on this. Being clean is good business as well. Being
It is now. It
clean
hasn't
is
always
smart.
been.
It's always been good business to be clean in a state, particularly like Florida, right? I see the mayor is here as an example. You know, we have about 127 million tourists that visited us last year. It makes Florida the most popular tourist destination in the world. Most people have to save all year long to take that family vacation. That's hard-working folks who have their disposable income at play to decide where they want to go. If they're on final approach in a Miami International, or going to Orlando and penetrate a smog bank, or go on the beach and get tar on their feet, or can't swim in the water because it's polluted, they're not going to come back. And if people have worked their whole lives somewhere else so they can retire to someplace beautiful like Florida, that also has no state income tax, which is nice, right? But they can't breathe the air, they're not going to come here. And if they don't do that, this state's in trouble economically, right? We're all going to start paying state income tax for those of us who live here, and it's going to be a real challenge. So being clean is good business. It's also the right thing to do for future generations. You know, I have a 20-year-old, and I don't want him and his generation and future generations to be working and focused on how to fix the mess we left behind. I want them focused on how to make the world even better going forward. So that's why we're focused on all these technologies and not wedded to just one, and making sure that we can try to drive the industry. So green hydrogen is something that I'm excited about.
So tell us about that project. You're going to make green hydrogen, but then blend it with natural gas.
We are. We're actually, look, electrolyzers have been around a long time. You take, you know, it's a piece of equipment that uses electricity to split the water molecule from hydrogen to oxygen. And we're going to do that, but power it with a solar facility instead of burning a fossil fuel, which typically is what's done using an electrolyzer. So we're actually in the process right now of going through the final engineering. We've teamed up with Cummins. We're going to use their electrolyzer equipment, but instead of powering it with fossil fuel, we're going to power it with an existing 75 megawatt solar facility. And then we're going to take the hydrogen that comes off of that, and we're going to blend it in to natural gas that currently is being put into a gas-fired, the most fuel-efficient gas-fired power plant in the world, which is in Okeechobee County, with the goal of being able to burn less and less methane, which is natural gas, and more hydrogen as you blend it. Now that sounds really simple. Here's the problem. Hydrogen molecules are a different size than methane molecules. And for those of you who took any chemistry, you'll know that starts to make a difference as it interacts with metals. And so when you put pure hydrogen into something like a gas turbine, which is a big jet engine, it turns the steel brittle. And if you think about it like a jet engine on an airplane, and if you don't want the steel to become brittle and those blades to break off and go through the engine, that's a really bad day. And so we need to work on new metallurgy, on new metals, on coatings for the existing metals, so we can actually repurpose those gas plants and turn them into pure hydrogen plants. And by the way, when you burn hydrogen, you get water vapor as your emissions. So we're going to have the hydrogen pilot program up in about a year. And then we're going to start blending more and more and more. And we're already working with GE and Siemens and the gas turbine manufacturers to look at how do we get that technology to work. And we're going to push them. I just met with the CEO of GE on Friday and said, look, we are 100% on board, and we need your best and brightest to work with our best and brightest. We need to figure out how to make this work.
Maybe you can have a ribbon cutting at the next Aspen Climate Conference.
I'd love that.
Making all sorts of plugs.
Would love that.
Well, we are in the Sunshine State, and solar is, of course, a hot topic here. I'm sure most of the crowd here is familiar with net metering and the rooftop solar debate here in Florida, but also around the country.
Sure.
But for those of you who may not be, net metering is the practice by which utilities pay rooftop solar households for their excess electricity. It's becoming a hot topic all over. Like I said, California's Governor Newsom has even expressed interest in opening it up to try to make it more equitable. Here in Florida, the governor recently vetoed a bill that would have reformed the policies here to a way that I think your company would have liked quite a lot more.
Partially. I wasn't even thrilled about that legislation, but it's okay. It was a start.
Can you give us a response, because this is a national issue, although it's a state issue with national implications? What's your response to that veto? The governor cited concerns about inflation.
Yeah, look, I want to be clear on this. Rooftop solar is something that I personally and the company has supported from the very beginning. And I have no problem with anybody who wants to put solar on their roof. In fact, I think people should have the absolute right to put on their roof, as long as they do it safely and meet electrical codes, then I think that's terrific. My issue with the current net metering policies in most states, all the states that I'm aware of at least, is that it requires electric utilities to purchase electricity back at a full retail rate, which means you're paying for an electron at a cost that also embeds the cost of distribution, transmission, billing, storm response, the whole suite of things that come with being an electric customer that we serve. Yet I'm buying a product that is effectively wholesale. I'm buying an electron, which is the same thing of buying it from a factory, a power plant. And so it's about 4 times more expensive. And that gets paid for by customers. This is not about electric utilities not having to pay something. You know, I think what people need to really appreciate is the fact that the cost of power is a cost that the commissions, the public service commissions, our regulators, must actually allow us to recover by law, because this is a state mandated requirement. And so if I pay 4 times more for an electric source, customers pay 4 times more. And just some numbers that I think are interesting. All right, so in Florida, 99.5% of our customers don't have rooftop solar. And there's nothing that restricts them from putting solar on their roof. The economics are challenging, and to be fair, in Florida, there are some challenges because of hurricanes and wind loading and permitting. So it's not that you can't do it, it's just, it's expensive. But 0.5% of our customers do have it. And they're getting right now, if you're an FPL customer, they're getting about $30 to a little more $1 million a year of extra benefit, and that's paid for by the other 99.5% of our customers. And I just have a problem with policies that are regressive, because you know, our average customer bill is $100. And so the challenge is that, you know, should somebody who lives, there are 2+ million people who live in condominiums in Florida. There are 7 million apartments in Florida. Those people, by definition, do not have a roof to put solar on. And yet they're paying for others to do that. I think utilities should be, and I'm fine with being required to purchase electricity from rooftop solar at the wholesale rate. Even that in itself is effectively a subsidy, because I really can't count on it. Because if a homeowner or a business doesn't maintain their facility and it's not producing electricity, then I have to go out and make sure that I can still meet the requirements of everybody. Because fundamentally, it's important to remember that all electric providers have a duty to serve. It's not an option. And I'll tell you what, if COVID taught me anything, it was the importance of meeting that duty to serve. Because those men and women who are in our hospitals keeping people alive, they can't do their job. Ventilators don't work if they don't have electricity. It's awfully hard to ask people to stay at home in quarantine and be safe if they don't have electricity. And I don't know how you educate your children online if you don't have electricity. And so fundamentally, we have to meet that duty to serve. I think rooftop solar can play an important part of it. I just don't think it's 4 times more valuable than ground-mounted solar. To me, we should be doing everything we can to enhance and improve and increase our amount of solar energy for the least cost. Because if we do it that way, it's politically longer, more sustainable is a better way of putting it, right? It's politically, people will accept it. And I worry about if at some point, people are struggling right now to make ends meet. And if we end up charging customers a lot more money than we need to, at some point there's gonna be a backlash. You're seeing it in California. California right now, Californians pay $1 billion more a year for electricity strictly because of net metering laws.
So
and that's expensive.
What do you say to people who think that your opposition to rooftop solar policy as it exists today in Florida, it sort of implies that you're sort of not supportive of acting big on climate change? Some people think that. What do you say to those people?
I say, look at our record. Nobody has actually built more renewables and built more solar than FPL and NextEra Energy, our sister company, Next Energy Resources, in the world. We generate more electricity from wind and solar and use more battery storage than anybody in the world. And we've been doing it, by the way, for over 30 years. Long before it was cool to be green and there were conferences like this, we were actually in the renewables business. And we focused on the economics of it as well, which is why we've been in the business for 30 years. And so, I am completely committed. Again, it's really for the future generations to make sure we do this right. But you can't be so dogmatic about the approach that you're not willing to embrace change and look at different ways of doing this. If that's the case, we would have never switched off of oil. We wouldn't be embracing alternatives like potentially green hydrogen. I don't know that it's going to work, but I know we must try. I don't know if we're going to be able to do other products like long storage batteries that last for 12 hours. It doesn't exist right now, but we're pushing the industry to do that. And so, it's a mentality of being willing to embrace innovation. I don't even think of us as an electric utility. We're a technology company that delivers power.
Just one last question on the rooftop solar debate. Where do you see compromise going forward? The state legislature will come back, and presumably this topic will come back up again. Are you willing to find a compromise?
Look, we did this last legislation, absolutely. I mean, this legislation, sure, I'll always be open to compromise. It's not, again, I want people to put solar on their roof if they want to. And if you live in a really high cost environment, and that's frankly what some folks who are in the rooftop business love California, because their prices are so high that it actually makes rooftop more affordable, more attractive, right? Part of the biggest barrier to entry in Florida for rooftop solar is the fact that our average bill is $100. And so your payback is measured in time longer than your panels are going to last. But you know what? Day to day, that's really important for our customers, because I want them to have more money in their pockets to go out and spend it on the things that they want, that they need, right? That they need for their families, rather than paying me a premium so I can pay for a premium product that I could otherwise do by ground-mounted solar or wind turbines or something else somewhere else in the country. It's important to understand, too, one size does not fit all. We own and operate more wind turbines as a corporation than anybody in America by far. There's not a single one in Florida. It's not because we don't love them. It's not because we don't know how to do it. We're headquartered here. It's because it doesn't make economic sense, but solar does. And so I just think it's important for us to all be disciplined, if we can, in a financial way, as well as saying, let's not be afraid of change. And I think we've demonstrated that by tearing down coal plants, getting off of oil, embracing new technologies like green hydrogen, and along the way, being a leader in technology that works. Again, nobody's built more solar than us, by far.
Speaking of economic sense and solar, I want to ask another question that's developing in Washington, D.C. As many of you probably know, the Commerce Department has recently initiated an investigation to whether Chinese solar manufacturers are going around tariffs. And so there's been a big impact on that from the solar industry, and would love your take on that. And how is this going to affect your business?
It's had a massive impact, unfortunately, on America. And it is unfortunate because when you're out spending billions of dollars, and in the case of the United States, it is literally tens and tens of billions of dollars that the electric industry is spending on solar projects. We're spending at FPL several $billion here in Florida this year. And then you can't get panels. It creates a real problem. 82% of all the panels that are installed in the United States come from 4 countries: Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And they're built there because the Commerce Department, excuse me, and the U.S. government in numerous administrations, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, they all determined that these countries were acceptable from a standpoint of being able to manufacture your panels. Enough value added was done when you were manufacturing those countries that they weren't subject to tariffs. And that has now been put on hold because the Department of Commerce has said, you know what, it's been 12 years, we should look at revisiting that. Well, you can't just build a solar factory overnight. And I think personally we should be doing more manufacturing for solar in the United States. Support it 100%.
It's my understanding
but we got to be smart about this.
But
we can't do it overnight.
It's my understanding that the Commerce Department had to respond to this petition by this company.
They have discretion as to whether or not to determine whether or not it meets initial threshold. I don't think it met the initial threshold. That's just one person's opinion. They obviously disagreed, even though they had previously determined the same Commerce Department multiple times before, including just last year. They had looked at the same exact issue, but because it was filed by companies who refused to actually acknowledge who they were, it was anonymously filed, the Commerce Department said, we don't think it's worth looking at. So then a company named Auxin, which has 60 employees in total, and manufactures very little solar in the United States, like 0.1%. They filed it, and they said, well, now if there's a name attached to it, we'll go ahead and look at it. Look, I think we need to be careful not to, look at it this way. Who's benefiting the most now from the fact that solar is shut down in the United States? I mean, solar is shut down. There are projects, there's over 300 projects that are right now either on hold or being canceled. And just a couple days ago, a utility in Indiana announced that they now have no choice because, again, remember, they have a duty to serve. Their solar projects have been canceled because they can't get panels and they have no visibility to be able to get panels for the next 2 to 3 years. They're going to keep their coal plant open for another 3 years. Oil and gas plants are going to be kept open longer because of this action. Again, I'm all for building more in the United States if possible, but understand there's a cost to that. I was personally involved in getting Jinko, which is a Chinese manufacturer, to bring a plant into Florida to build. And we bought every panel that they manufactured, the entire output of the plant, which is why they moved here initially. But unfortunately for them, the cost structure is still more expensive than any other facility they have in their global supply chain. And so we're kidding ourselves as Americans if we don't think they have other places to go. The panels that are not being shipped right now out of the 4 countries I mentioned, they're not just stopping manufacturing in those countries. They're selling them to Europe. They're selling them to other countries. And they're just fine. So we're just losing out. We're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. Global supply chains are important. And I want, again, to build as much as we can for the least cost. And we need to be very thoughtful about what can we do here in America that makes sense, and what should we be buying from overseas and then installing here in America that makes sense.
Have you had any communications with the White House or any part of the Biden administration?
Absolutely. We've been very involved from the very beginning.
And what's their response?
They're looking at it. Very thoroughly. And look, you know what? Once they open the investigation, they have a duty to do so and to meet the obligations, and that's great. I would just encourage them to use the least amount of time possible that is appropriate to do it, because if we don't address this quickly, there will be a knock-on effect that will last for years. This is not something you can just restart with a snap of a finger. And so, I have projects that we have built. We have 2022 projects in Florida that have been approved by our commission that we can go out and build. We're done. Those are actually in operation. I have 50 solar plants in operation, but I have more coming online in 23 and more coming online in 24, and those plants are going to start to become negatively impacted or stopped, because I can't just get manufacturers. There are none in the United States that have panels available. We've gone to everybody who does, including Auxin, and said, we'll buy anything you have. Give it to us. And they're like, we don't have any panels available until 2026.
Is that what Auxin said?
Yeah.
Well, stay tuned, I guess. I want to switch to another topic.
By the way, the Biden administration, Department of Commerce, they should hear from you. If you care about this issue, right, this is impacting all of us. And it's important to hear from folks to understand. We're also laying thousands of people off in the field. I mean, literally tens of thousands, actually, of construction workers are going home, because you can only build so many steel posts and the racking and everything else, but if you can't put solar panels on, there's nothing to do. And we can't just afford to have people sitting around twiddling their thumbs, so they're going home. So it's hitting people's pocketbooks as well.
I want to turn to another topic that you alluded to just very briefly early on in our conversation. That's nuclear power. I think it provides 22% of your mix.
Correct.
A quick raise of hands, though, of those of you joining us in person in the audience. Raise your hand if you think nuclear power should be part of the solution to climate change.
Sorry, I'm really...
Okay,
wow.
we have a good...
Yeah.
That's good. That's because, as all of us know, nuclear power has had a bit of a controversial past in this space, but it does provide an inevitable and obvious source of carbon-free electricity. So tell us how you see nuclear power in your mix going forward. And it's my understanding you're looking to extend the licenses of some of your reactors, but you're not looking to try to do advanced nuclear power.
So we have 4 units in Florida at 2 locations, and we have invested in those plants over the years to modernize those and make them even more efficient. So without actually touching the core, we've been able to actually increase the output of those by having more efficient steam generators, by actually taking bends out of the pipes, because if you remember from your physical science days in high school, anytime you have to push something around a corner, it takes more energy to do it. So we've really tried to be creative and say, how can we make our existing plants even more efficient? And we've invested several $1 billion in doing that by also modernizing them and putting in digital controls, as an example. We've been able to actually extend the life. And so we were one of the first in the country to actually get license extension granted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for an additional 20 years. And then we actually filed and were granted the first license at our Turkey Point facility, which is not too far from here, to get another 20 years, because it's really about whether or not the concrete for the containment building can last, and you have to invest in all the equipment inside. And we were able to demonstrate that those plants are able to safely operate for well beyond the existing 40 years and at least for 80 years. And I think that is so important and frankly smart for America to do. We should be investing in these assets to make sure that they run safely for as long as possible, because they are 0 carbon and they run 24 hours a day. Now, like any technology, nuclear power is not a silver bullet, because it runs most efficiently when it runs 24 hours a day. And the amount of electricity that we all use fluctuates, because when you go to sleep, as an example, right, a lot of appliances are turned off. Air conditioners in some parts of the house are not used, et cetera, right? Stoves aren't being used, water heaters aren't being used. And so at night, typically consumption goes down quite a bit, and everything cools off because the sun's not up. So nuclear power plants aren't really good at ramping up and down to meet those changes in loads. So you need a nuclear power plant to be able to run very steadily and meet what we call that base load power. So even around the clock, it's being used. But for those parts of the day when it gets hot and you start actually people turning on the more and more air conditioning, or they come home at night and turn on lights and stoves, we need other types of generation that can meet that. Because if you try to start a nuclear power plant up, it takes days. It's not something you can fire up in an hour or 2 or instantly. And that's part of the challenge that it's hard for people who aren't in the business to understand, but we literally have to meet the needs of people instantly. This light that's coming through, the electricity that is powering this, is being generated right now, instantly. Right? It travels at the speed of light. So blink your eye, goes around the world 7 times. And so we have to be able to meet that load instantly. Some technologies are better at that than others.
So Eric, for my very quick concluding question,
sure.
And to give us a taste of something maybe we can come back to talk about next year.
Okay.
You call yourself a technology company. What is one technology that we haven't talked about that we can get excited about for next year?
You know, I'm really excited about changes in battery technology, particularly things like solid-state batteries that extend the range of vehicles beyond what we're seeing now, which is typically the 250 to 350 mile range, which is great. But, you know, I don't know about you. I'll admit here, even though I know we're being streamed, that I don't always drive 55. So, you know, when I was driving my, Tesla, I never got to 232 mile range. And particularly when it's hot and the air conditioner's running. When we start getting into ranges that are 800 miles, as an example, I think that is going to take a lot of the range anxiety away. It's going to drive up adoption. We'll be able to then really start to move away from fossil-fueled vehicles and more into electric vehicles, particularly for cars. Long-haul trucking, I'm excited about hydrogen, actually, because I think that may actually play a role. Again, water vapor is your emissions, and we need something that goes beyond, because you can't have a truck driver go 800 miles and then have to stop and charge for 2 hours. That's just not economic. That's not how the system works, typically. So we need to have a good mix, or ships is another, the previous speaker. You can't have a ship go out for 800 miles and say, oh, well, I guess we're going to have to wait to charge up. So we have to come up with a variety of technologies. So battery storage, and then I continue to be excited about hydrogen, but we're going to need a lot of work in metallurgy and coatings and thinking about how we transport that hydrogen is important, because you can't store it right now very efficiently, and we're going to need to burn a lot of it if we're going to replace all natural gas, and I'm all for that.
Great. Well, we have a lot to talk about next time.
Absolutely.
Eric, thank you so much for your time, and everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.
Please welcome Tony Leiserowitz.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much to the Aspen Institute for the invitation to join you. This has been such a great event already. I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure you have as well. My name is Anthony Leiserowitz. I direct the Yale program on climate change communication. And we study how do Americans and other societies around the world respond to the issue of climate change. What do people understand and misunderstand about the causes, consequences, and solutions to climate change? How do they perceive the risks, so the likelihood and severity of different types of impacts? What kinds of policies do people support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are people engaged in that will help us maintain a safe and stable climate? But then ultimately, as scientists, our real question is answering why. What are the underlying psychological, cultural, and political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue, others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile, or at least they are here in the United States. So one of the very first cardinal rules of effective communication is know your audience. Who are they? Where are they coming from? What do they know? What do they think they know? Who do they trust? Where do they get their news and information? And what are their underlying values? Ultimately, what do they care about? And then how can you tailor your approach to engage them based on where they are, not where you are? For those that saw Eric Schmidt earlier today, I could spend an hour talking with Eric about the role of clouds in climate models. That's not an appropriate conversation for most people, okay? So how do you meet people where they are to help connect this issue to them? So in our work, starting now over 15 years ago, we very quickly realized that Americans don't have a single viewpoint on climate change, or frankly, any important issue. And then the world was often divided into climate believers and climate deniers. But that's way too simplistic and not actually very helpful. So in our analyses, we found what we've since called Global Warming 6 America, 6 distinct segments of the American public that each respond to this issue in a very different way. Now, these are defined not by demographics, but by what's in people's heads, in other words, what they believe about climate change, what's in their hearts, how they feel about the issue, and what's in their hands. What are they doing or willing to do about this issue? So let me quickly introduce the 6 Americas. So this is from our latest nationally representative study conducted just last September. And what we found is that 33% of Americans are what we call the alarmed. These are people who are firmly convinced climate change is happening, it's human-caused, it's serious, it's urgent. They strongly support action, and they're really eager to get involved themselves. The next group, at 25%, is what we call the concerned. And these are people who also think climate change is real, it's human-caused, it's serious, but many of them still think of it as distant. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears, or maybe some developing countries, but not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it becomes psychologically distant. It just becomes one of a dozen other issues that's out there, and yes, I kind of support action, but I don't yet see why this is an urgent issue. Then a group that we call the cautious. These are people who are still on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious, or is it kind of overblown? They're paying attention, but are still kind of confused. Then a small, but I think very important group at 5% that we call the disengaged. And these are people who basically say, you know, I think I once heard that term global warming, but I don't know what that is. I don't know what the causes are. I don't know what the consequences are. I don't know what the solutions are. Okay? It's basic awareness is the primary barrier they face because they never see it in the media they pay attention to. They never hear about it from their friends and family. Then comes a group we call the doubtful. These are people who say, you know, I don't think climate change is real, but if it is, it's natural, just natural cycles. Nothing humans have anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about, so I don't really pay that much attention to it. And then last but not least is the group that we call the dismissive at 9%. These are people who are firmly convinced climate change is not real, It is not human caused. It is not a serious problem, and most of whom quite literally tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and many other such conspiracy-type narratives. Now, importantly, they're 9%. They're only 9%, but they're a really loud 9%. They're a really vocal 9%. They're more than adequately represented in the halls of Congress, and they have tended to dominate the public square to such an extent that the other 91% of Americans, many of them are afraid to talk about climate change because they're afraid that the other person they start the conversation with will get in an argument or a fight with them, okay? But they're only 9%. Climate change has joined sex, religion, and politics as topics people won't talk about at the Thanksgiving Day table because they don't want to upset their uncle, and it's often an uncle. So the point is that there are these 6 very different audiences that each respond differently, and they need to be each engaged in their own terms. So just to really emphasize the point that there are totally different conversations happening in this country all at the same time, we've asked Americans, if you could ask an expert on climate change one question, what question would you ask? The doubtful and dismissive are saying, so how do you know that climate change is happening or human caused? And on a deeper level, why should I trust you? The middle groups, however, are saying, okay, climate change is real, but so what? Why should I care? How does this touch anything that I care about? Whereas the alarmed and concerned are saying, okay, I got it, it's happening, it's human caused, it's serious, but what do we do? What can I do as an individual? What can we do as a community, as a city, as a state, as the nation, and as the world? And as a community, we have generally done a much better job communicating the problem to the alarmed than we have the solutions, which is why this conference has been so exceptional. Okay, so we've been tracking the changes in these different groups for 15 years, and here I'm just showing you the last 6 because this is really, really important. We've seen the alarm have grown by 22 percentage points in the last 6 years. All the other groups have gotten smaller because Americans as a whole are moving into the alarmed. And the critical thing I want you to look at is where they were in 2015. The alarmed and the dismissive were basically tied at about 11 and 12%. 1 alarmed for every 1 dismissive. Today, there are nearly more than 3 alarmed for every 1 dismissive. And that reflects a fundamental shift in the underlying social, cultural, and political climate of climate change. It means that these trends, if they continue, and they've been continuing this way for a while, are going to help us get to the point where we have more climate winds, those winds go farther, and they're going to be more durable. And last thing to say is for those that really want to get deeper into this topic, I will be having an entire hour session just around the corner in the Truist Pavilion tomorrow from 3:30 to 4:30. Thank you.
And now Barton Seaver with Jennifer Morris of the Nature Conservancy.
Well, good afternoon. We have a really interesting session that we're going to start right now about seafood. Healthy communities and seafood and our relationship with the oceans. And I have here my new friend, Bart Seaver, who is an absolutely incredible guy. So you have done so much in your life when it comes to your chef. You worked with Jose Andres.
I did. Yeah.
You are a health expert, worked at Harvard. Yeah. You are an author of many, many books, 8 books, I believe. 8 books. And you have called yourself a seafood evangelist. Okay, but let's talk about this for a minute. So I'm the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, and I have to say the fisheries industry, especially the wild-caught fisheries industry, is one of the worst on the planet, right? Bycatch, forced labor, but yet you call yourself a seafood evangelist. So tell us a little bit about yourself and why you would consider yourself a seafood evangelist.
Well, thanks, first of all, just the honor to share stage with you and to all of you. I wore this t-shirt on purpose because all of us love something. I think all of you love hope itself, and I love you for that. So thank you all for all the work that you do. So I'm a seafood evangelist. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in a very multi-ethnic neighborhood called Mount Pleasant, where there's a lot of Eritrean, Ethiopian, Guatemalan, Honduran. And Interesting time to be growing up in DC back then. But I really learned the power of food through those communities and those peoples who were escaping civil unrest in their own countries, largely. And that really pushed me onto a trajectory of really caring about food. I worked in restaurants, worked my way up, lived and worked all over the world, and had the great mentorship of Jose Andres, a gentleman, Robert Egger, founder of DC Central Kitchen, where I learned, again, sort of the deeply humanitarian aspects around food. And I became very interested in seafood in my restaurants, simply because it's the most interesting palette of ingredients to work with. I mean, it's just fun. But also at that time, coming up, is really when we were beginning to understand fully the impacts that we were having, the incredible damage that we could do to ecosystems. And also, as a chef myself, I was beginning to understand the damage we could do to our own bodies through the choices we make for dinner. And the other side of that coin, though, is if we can damage and make sick, we can heal and we can restore. And so I began a campaign around, in my restaurants, just around sustainable seafood, really understanding the source, the provenance, and the purpose of the products that I was serving. And then I had opportunity to sort of further that, and I walked into the world as an explorer for the National Geographic Society, and I set out to help do the work of getting people to fix seafood. And while I was out there in the world doing this work, seeing the incredible work that so many NGOs were doing and people, other chefs, I began to understand that seafood could be incredibly sustainable. That when done right, the terrible, terrible ills that plague the industry can be shown to be solved. And so I began, instead of asking people to fix seafood, I began to see an opportunity to use seafood to fix people, to create economic opportunities, to create positive environmental outcomes, and to create certainly positive public health outcomes. And so I am a seafood evangelist now. I see this as a means to inspire and to spark new economies, new ways of thinking and relating to our world through the foods that we eat so intimately, taking into our literal body through food, the transcommunication of the world into ourselves. Well, while there is still a ton of work to be done out there that your organization and so many others are so bravely and nobly doing, I believe that we should look at seafood largely as this category of solutions.
So great, I love that answer. And I'm just curious, Bart, so you've focused so much of your career on looking at the intersections between the health of our bodies and what we put into them, and seafood. So a lot of folks would say, okay, well, we know that there's lots of chemicals in the fish that we eat, right? So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on certification. So how do consumers, like those in the audience here and listening online, how do we make decisions about what seafood we should be eating? Because it's almost a dizzying array of certification standards, and I have my little Monterey Bay Aquarium card that I take to restaurants with me, but I'm like, okay, which one is it now? And it needs to be updated and all that. It's confusing.
Yeah,
so tell us how do we choose what we should be eating?
How do you navigate the alphabet chowder,
exactly,
I call it?
Yes.
Sure, you've got BAP, GAA, ASC, and all of these.
All those, yeah.
And all of them, to some degree, or largely to a very large degree, really do represent a great choice behind it, and really very rigorous audited work behind it. And it's the large companies. It's Walmart, it's McDonald's, it's Red Lobster, it's Darden, the world's largest purchasers of seafood that have really done this work. And at the outset of sustainability, quite honestly, sustainability is this sort of unsexy idea. Like, if we all revolutionize the world, right, what will happen? It will stay the same. Like,
do you want your marriage to be sustainable? No.
No, we want it to be thriving, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly.
So this idea that sustainability is sort of a cover your ass, approach really has evolved now to looking at seafood as a solution to some of the diet-related issues that we have. And certainly certifications are a big part of our decision-making process as individuals, but also for companies. But there's a larger paradigm in effect here, and that is that seafood is somewhat considered guilty before proven innocent. Well, I've heard that seafood's farmed, and all farmed seafood's bad. Well, that has Fukushima radiation, and this has methyl mercury in it, and slave labor over here, and like, oh my God, these are terrible things, and we've got to address them. But the bottom line is that doesn't paint the entire picture. And when we look to the American diet, the Western diet being a protein-centric center of the plate, we need to look at seafood in that context. How does it then stack up against beef, pork, chicken, lamb, veal, turkey, which is really what we eat, over 200 pounds plus per person per year? Well, if we look at seafood versus those other proteins, well, across 5 very important metrics, from freshwater use, land use alterations, antibiotic use, feed conversion ratio, and carbon emissions, seafood simply has a fin up in the sustainability game. And why? Well, because you and me, we're fighting gravity and atmospheric pressure and keeping our brains and blood warm and all this stuff that we have to do to fight this, to exist in this relatively harsh environment. Fish? No, dude, I float. It's cool. So there's a biological efficiency there that we should take advantage of. And when it comes to the American diet in particular, looking at top causes of death, diet and lifestyle-related diseases, look at seafood begins to be a moral choice. If Americans were to decrease the amount of red meat that we eat and increase servings of seafood, omega-3 rich seafood, to twice a week, we would reduce cardiac mortality incidences by 36%. We would reduce overall mortality incidence by 17%. We would improve the quality of cognition, development in pregnant and nursing mothers, as well as in preserving cognition, eye health, helping to manage diabetes, mood disorder. I mean, it is incredible. So it begins to look like a moral issue. So much so that I would say, and Dariush Mozaffarian, Dean of Tufts School of Nutrition, says the 3 S's of public health are don't smoke, wear your seatbelt, and eat seafood. It's that important. So when we begin to look at the moral issues around what are our choices on the dinner plate, seafood begins to look pretty good. And when we begin to look at sort of the larger paradigm of how that seafood is produced and what good can come from those systems, socio-ecological systems, we look pretty good, and that's where your work really comes in.
Well, yes, but I will push back a little bit, because in addition to what you just said, and I agree with you, we know that seafood has 6 times less emissions than beef, for example. So from a climate perspective, here we are at the Aspen Climate Ideas session, it's really important that we think about. However, we also know there's some really big issues, macro issues with the fishing industry, the wild-caught fishing industry in particular. And one of the big initiatives that the Nature Conservancy is working on is trying to disrupt that industry. Because, for example, with tuna, skipjack tuna, which is sort of the tuna that you get in your tuna fish, is rife with challenges, not just from the bycatch and the forced labor, but also the fact that the countries who supply this fish are getting pennies on the pound for the fish that they're allowing to be fished from their waters. So how do we disrupt that? And we're working with the Republic of Marshall Islands on a new company, basically, that's going to enable the Republic of Marshall Islands, instead of just selling their vessel days and getting pennies on the dollar, to actually maintain 100% of the net profits for their fishing. And that is so critical right now, because it's a huge part of their gross domestic product. And these countries that have relied on tourism during COVID are absolutely devastated. One of the only other natural assets they have is their fish. So how do we disrupt that industry in a way that will support those countries? We were really excited that Walmart is going to be our very first buyer of this new company's fish. So that's kind of, I think, really important as we think about seafood and the seafood industry, that the aspects of, yes, the lower emissions are really important, and as you mentioned, the health, but we've got to change the economic models around the fishing industry. And I think one thing that's exciting that's happening is aquaculture. Now, again, there's been lots of discussion about the sort of the value of aquaculture, but there's also lots of challenges. When we hear about aquaculture, we hear about, oh, we're actually raising fish to feed fish. That doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing that? Or we're clearing mangroves to grow shrimp. Why are we doing that? Does that really make sense? Love to get your thoughts on the aquaculture sector in particular.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to mention also at the outset, when we're talking about disrupting the economics, like, wouldn't it just be easier to not fish? You know, well, yes, in some circumstances, but that's a rather dire outcome for other circumstances, which is that almost 1 in 10 people on this planet are wholly dependent upon fisheries for their livelihood. 1 in 10. Seafood represents 2% of the global food supply, but 10% of the livelihoods on this planet. Its impact is so outsized that we must consider wild fisheries as part of the human heritage and our future. Where does aquaculture come into that? Well, that's the huge disruptor, is that we can now create, we are literally witnessing the creation of a food system. The last time we got to do that was about 10,000 years ago, when we planted the seeds of civilization with agriculture. And we are witnessing it, these generations right now. And you know what? We got it wrong at first. And there were a lot of abuses that we still hold the industry accountable to, but largely a lot of those mistakes have been addressed. Monterey Bay Aquarium has green-listed farmed salmon. I mean, we have solutions to a lot of the issues. And when you look at just farmed salmon, fine, that's sort of the poster fish, if you will, but then there's a whole subset of species that, I mean, we've only ever really grown about 100 species of seafood in aquaculture. And the industry is about 55 years old, right? I mean, things advance very quickly. And so when we look at farm-raised shellfish, we begin to see, I mean, just incredible opportunities, and this is nearshore. When we look at kelp, we begin incredible opportunities. I mean, we have some represented here in the audience. We have Running Tide, Marty Odland from Running Tide, and their kelp and their carbon sequestration that they're doing there. Right here in Florida, you've got an incredible program, All Clams on Deck, which is helping to plant clams to remediate environmental issues and nutrient overload while also restoring eelgrass, which is 10% of the carbon on this planet is absorbed through eelgrass. I mean, it's just incredible the outcomes that we can have with aquaculture. And what's amazing is that it's all delicious too, and it begins to put us into, especially with shellfish aquaculture, a new sociological ecosystem. And what does that mean? It means a system that's based on relationships and cultural expectations around conservation ethics. It's based on a mutual understanding of the purpose of a food system, which is the endurance of thriving humans, where the entire watershed is considered a single system. All the way from Mount Katahdin all the way down to the Gulf of Maine, or from the Mississippi River and headwaters all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where everybody becomes vested in a single system that ultimately produces economic outcomes, a generation of sentinel stewards on our waters, standing there sentinel for us, creating delicious food that sustains our bodies.
So let's pick up on that for a second. So oysters.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about oysters and how amazing they are. 50 gallons of water per day are being filtered by oysters. So if you have any choice in seafood that you would eat, farm-raised seafood, oysters would be it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Farm-raised mussels, clams, oysters, kelp, scallops.
Kelp. I've never had a kelp sandwich, I don't think.
It's coming.
It's
Don't
coming?
worry.
Okay.
Don't worry. It's
coming to a restaurant near you. Well, one of the things that we didn't mention about oysters, which is also, I think, very compelling vis-a-vis other types of aquaculture, is its climate adaptation benefits.
Yes.
So specifically, we worked on a project called SOAR, supporting oyster aquaculture and restoration, including here, 6 projects here in Florida, where we're able to buy, during COVID in particular, buying oysters that got too big and they couldn't sell, the oyster farmers couldn't sell them. So we supported 125 different oyster organizations, oyster businesses, and took those oysters that they couldn't sell and we put them into natural reefs to protect against storms and sea level rise as well, but mostly for storms. So the oysters are really, really incredible. I didn't really eat oysters that much, but now that I learned all of this about it, how incredible they are, I am now an oyster evangelist and definitely eating it all the time I can. But what else? I mean, we don't have a ton of time left, but I'd love just to hear your thoughts on, again, if you're thinking about the choices that you should make as a consumer when it comes to seafood, help our audience understand what they should be eating and how they should be choosing what to eat.
Well, thanks for that. Well, I think first off, we need to just decide that seafood is part of dinner. It is also part of our future. One of the big obstacles to increasing the amount of sustainable aquaculture is a lack of social license. And the idea that, I mean, the oceans haven't been mentioned a whole lot yet in the sessions that I've been sitting in. They're 99% of the livable space on this planet, 70% of its surface. They are the ecological driver of this planet. And we consider land beautiful for our presence there, cultured even, but we consider the oceans beautiful for our absence there. And as we envision a new future, a new ideation of just humans' presence on this planet, what does it look like? I would ask you all to just consider seafood and consider specifically aquaculture, especially farm-raised shellfish and bivalves. What needs to happen is for us to see ourselves on that water. I mean, if I ask you to picture a farm, the settler America vision of the undulating hills, bathed in autumn splendor, setting sun, with perfectly patterned rows of corn leading the eye off into the distance, with a perfect house, white paint, paint chipping, the red barn color fading, like, hot damn, this is the thread by which the fabric of settler America was built, right? But when we consider a farm or a fishery, we might stand on a dock and gaze wistfully out at the wine dark sea and think as though a fishery happens elsewhere, executed by someone other. But turn around on that dock and look inward and see the quality of education and the quality of opportunities that people have to stay in their place, to become stewards of their own legacy, to be in a place. And when we see a fishery or a farm as such, we see our own values reflected in it. We see it as the sum of the labors and aspirations of a community. And especially with aquaculture, what is so important is that, as Cheyenne opened this entire session with, we all stand on indigenous land always, and the coastlines in particular. And this is an opportunity for us to rematriate the commons of our oceans into the communion of our commons, and to learn from 10,000 years of sustained native fisheries and even farming of shellfish on our coasts, to learn from that knowledge, to right those wrongs, to eat deliciously, and to thrive.
Love it. Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Catherine Flowers, Reverend Lennox Yearwood, and Xiye Bastida with Justin Worland of Time Magazine.
Okay, I'm Justin Worland. I write about climate at Time Magazine, and I'm really happy to be here for this conversation about environmental and climate justice. And so just to introduce the panelists very quickly, we have Catherine Coleman Flowers, who is the founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. Xiye Bastida, who's a climate justice activist and co-founder of the Re-Earth Initiative, and Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr., who is the president and CEO of Hip Hop Caucus. So just to start this discussion, I'm sure there's a lot of different levels of knowledge about environmental justice in the audience, and I just want to tee up the conversation to give each of you a minute to just say, when you're thinking about justice in the context of the environmental movement, in the context of the climate movement, what does justice mean to you? And we can just go down the line.
Well, justice means to me that you shouldn't be able to tell who's living next to the factory that's killing people based on their income or their race.
Right.
For me, the environmental justice movement, the main takeaway that I've gotten time and time again is how old it is. We keep thinking that we just came through with the new definitions of climate justice, that we're just getting the wording right. But the first Summit for Environmental Justice was in 1991, 30 years ago. So that's what I keep coming back to, that it's part of our DNA of communities that have been fighting for all of these rights. Environmental justice is embedded in every historical decision that we've made.
Justice is liberation. Justice is longevity. Justice means that people who look like me live longer than they are currently living.
Well, it's a great way to start here. I want to pick up on what you said, Xiye. Thinking about the long history of the environmental justice movement, and as you said, dating back decades, and yet there's been some progress, but there also has been a lot to be desired. And so I want to ask, how have things changed, particularly in the last few years? given the increased awareness of environmental inequities around COVID, the increased conversation at the national level here, but also at the international level. How much have things changed, in these last few years after this long history where there have been some accomplishments, but also some challenges? And we can also just go down the line with this one.
Well, you want me?
Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
I think the way things have changed, first of all, we're having this discussion at the Aspen Institute. That's a big change. I think the other part that's really different about it is that we have a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. That has never happened before. So I'm hearing and seeing people talk about environmental justice in places and spaces where I've never heard it before. Now we have to get to the action to get to the justice. But the fact that we're acknowledging the problem, I think about the 12-step program with addiction. The first step is acknowledging that you have a problem. So we've acknowledged that we have a problem. Now it's time to get to the action and change it.
Yeah. Xiye, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the way in which things have changed is that we are redefining our definition of environmentalism. Because from looking at the media, environmentalism was always the straws, the turtles, which are important, but it was never people's health, it was never community health, it was never, like Catherine said, who lives next to the power plants, who lives next to the waste sites. And so we are redefining what justice means in spaces that have never heard climate justice before and have never heard the terms environmental racism before. And mostly within youth, because we have never been so connected before. We are able to really go to every community, and I have a youth there who tells me what the situation is, where they are. And I'm gonna use this opportunity to bring up that the youth of Florida actually wrote a letter to FPL, to the CEO, to ask them for transparency in their net zero plans. And I know that just because somebody reached out to me, and that's happening all around the world. So I think that that's why the environmental justice movement is kind of breathing so much more now, because we're not only working intergenerationally, but globally and recognizing the injustices that our peers are going through around the world.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Reverend Yearwood, do you have?
Yeah, that's a hard question for many reasons. I would hope, because of time's sake, people would just Google, Google environmental justice movement and go back to either Warren County, North Carolina, or in Texas, or over there with our dear sister Catherine in Alabama. So do that. But the reality is that it's been around for a while, and so it's not new. The fact that we are talking about it like it is new or needs to be kind of put in means that our movement has been a very siloed movement and has put that into a bucket. And so I think that the reality now is that that bucket is literally overflowing with injustice. And so thanks to this new administration, but to be honest, the reality is that that bucket overflows with Black, brown, indigenous, queer, male, female, straight, gay, theist, atheist, people's lives who have died because of pollution and dirty water. And so I think that all we've been asking for is a movement that literally tells this government to enforce their laws to protect its citizens. And I think we're also asking for a climate movement to realize that while it is critically important to talk about the animals, the other species called humans that are being killed by policies and by corporations whose business plan means a death sentence for them, to fight them as hard as you do for the other species as well.
Right. Very, very powerful. I'm particularly struck by this idea of overflowing, the idea that this recognition is coming not because of any sort of altruism or something, but that it's just so evident, it's overflowing, that what else can you do? It's very powerful. I want to ask a bit about the federal level here in the US. Catherine, you mentioned the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which you are on. Of course, President Biden came to office and signed an executive order, the Justice 40 executive order, which I'll let you explain. But I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about the Justice 40 initiative. And then I'd just be curious, I think we'd all be curious to hear your take on whether the administration is meeting its promises, its relatively big promises on environmental justice.
Well, I think that the administration has made a step in the right direction. Whether it is meeting all of its promises, that remains to be seen. But I think the first step is that 40% of the benefits, especially from this bipartisan infrastructure bill, should go to communities that have been overburdened and under-resourced. And that's what Justice 40 is about. And making sure, I guess the other part of it is, it's going to take not only the administration, but probably everybody in this room and organizations and corporations to press these states to do the right thing. Because a lot of these environmental justice communities are in those situations because these states have decided that it's okay to have sacrifice zones in Cancer Alley, or that it's okay that people don't get sanitation in Lowndes County, that they would rather they have outhouses instead. So we have to make them feel very uncomfortable to not take that 40% and do what they've always done, but send it to their favorite communities or send it to the more affluent communities and leave those other communities behind.
Yeah. Well, Reverend Yearwood, do you have anything to add on that, either at the federal level or also I'd be curious, if you want to pick up on the states also, and anything there?
Well, I think, Catherine, you're pretty good there.
Okay. Well, then let me ask you a different question, which is, another institution that talked a lot about, coming to understand environmental justice is philanthropy, right? And in the last few years. So I want to get your take on how philanthropy is doing. I'm sure there's maybe some philanthropists in the room, but how do you think they're doing? What more needs to be done in that area?
Well, I'm one. I mean, I'm senior advisor at Bloomberg. Yeah. I think that one can do more, but I think there needs to be a Justice 40, not only for the federal government, but also in philanthropy. I think that the New School did a study in which they looked at the 12 top foundations in this climate sector. And in that, the New School said that out of that $1.34 billion out of those 12 entities that are giving, only 1.3% go to BIPOC-led organizations. That's ridiculous. That is not a sustainable movement. We need to have a Justice 40 in philanthropy. 40% of that 1.3 billion should have gone to environmental justice. I know you're not clapping, but I'm okay with that. But 40% should have went to environmental justice organizations and organizations led by BIPOC. If we are in a crisis, and if we are truly going to deal with the crisis we are in, that means that while we are holding the federal government and state governments and local governments accountable to ensure that 40% of the incentives go toward disadvantaged communities, then we in philanthropy have to do the same thing. And I just want to shout out definitely donors of color. I want to shout out obviously many groups, and I want to say I want to say this too. I am happy because I am seeing and having many conversations with other folks in the donor world, from MacArthur and JPB and Hewlett and others who are in the sector, definitely at my house and at Bloomberg. But I want to say this though, we have to do more because we have also caused harm to this movement because we have propped up a movement based upon privilege and white supremacy. And so we now have to take away from that to reinvest, to really create not only the movement, but the world that we want to see.
Well, very, very powerful stuff. Xiye, I want to turn to you and shift gears a little bit and talk about the global picture. You've been active with Fridays for Future and for other initiatives to move the conversation on the global stage. What do you think, thinking about COP27, how do you push the climate justice agenda and make sure that it gets the attention that it's due?
Well, I think that the first step and I'm going to build up on what Catherine said before here, the first step in recognizing that we need to bring these conversations of justice to the global level is also recognizing who the culprit is, which is the fossil fuel industry. And the words oil, gas, and coal are not included in the IPCC report. How is that possible? And the other facet of this is when I'm going to these conferences, last COP26, 500 delegates were from the fossil fuel industry. So we have people infiltrating the spaces that are supposed to be where we are, building a better world, and they're being obstructed. And this is happening in every room, which means that we have to not only call these things out, but also look out for each other in the movement. It's not only about being a united front, but being a united body. And this happens in the youth movement as well. Like, I know adult organizations probably have some disagreements, or, we're just humans, that happens, disagreements happen. And the youth movement is the same. And we are also disconnected in some places, but we have to make the effort to reach out to the youth who are in the UN, working for the UN and Youngo, for example, and making those conscious efforts to build the bridges that have not been built, because we see each other as being from separate worlds. And that doesn't only need to happen among the youth and us bringing that united message to all of these different spaces that we're in, but it needs to happen intergenerationally. I still see people surprised when youth come in and we're saying the exact same things that they've been saying, or we're bringing in different perspectives that are more challenging, and we're bringing in more radical imagination of the future. And the truth is that the only way in which we're going to get to a world that is net zero by 20, not 50, sooner than that, and a world that is just and regenerative, and where youth are learning about the climate crisis in school, the only way in which we're going to get there is when we challenge our own spaces and ask the hard questions so that we can get the right answers. Because we're not asking those hard questions nearly enough. And we started our meeting 2 days ago within the youth movement with, let's cut to the chase. No going around. Why have we not been talking to each other before among these different organizations? And so that's my perspective. We have to stop talking and challenging each other more.
Yeah.
Can I piggyback on something? Because me and my sister, we were in Scotland together, and we were at this thing where she's talking about, in which they invited the CEO of Shell. And many, particularly young people, were outraged. Other actors were outraged too as well, because this is the situation. And I've been thinking about that, and since we were together, which seems long, but actually short in that process. But the one thing I just want to say, I thought about that, and I thought about, we are fossil fuel abolitionists. That's who we are. Fossil fuel abolitionists. And I thought about that from the standpoint why young people got so outraged, because I thought about the earlier abolitionists, Catherine, who dealt with slavery. How would they have felt if, when they were having Frederick Douglass and Susan B. and all those were coming together, how would they have felt if during the abolitionist meeting of their day, they would have invited the slave trader to that meeting? That's what young people see. They're like, why are you, if you're really serious about abolishing slavery, how are you going to invite the slave trader to a meeting with slaves and those trying to abolish it? And so until we get real serious, young people are saying that this game that we're playing has got to come to an end.
Yes.
Well, I want to follow up on that. I'll start with you, but I'd love to hear everybody's perspectives. Just a bit about how you actually build a movement that is, able to take on these issues. And you said something that struck me on our sort of prep call, where you were talking about moving slowly to reach across, to really get a diverse movement together. So maybe you could talk about what that means and why that matters.
Yeah, I think we got to build a movement, one, on radical love, right? We got to start there. We got to build a movement on this premise that has to be, this is to win, a movement that is a BIWOC, leaderful movement, a Black, brown, indigenous, woman of color, leaderful movement, a woman that is led by women. I think that's the way we're going to win on the climate crisis. I think we also have to be patient I think many of us have been in this sector, and I think that we have to broaden our movement. And I think in doing that, other communities may not be there at this point. And so we're going to have to move sometimes slow. We're moving fast I think we made some bodily policy mistakes. I think in 2011, when we pushed hard on ACES with the Waxman Markey, and I think then 10 years later, where we are now with Build Back Better, we have not built consensus. And I think that we're seeing that we're not winning on that aspect. And we know that either you shape policy or policy shapes you. And so we are not shaping the policy to confront the climate crisis. And so I think that we need to build power by either using two things. One is either organizing and activism or using narrative and storytelling in media. I think that we put a lot of resources in the organizing, but storytelling, narrative, and media is critical to broaden this movement. And we need to invest in those areas as well, because that will help us to make sure our movement grows and be patient. Let me just say this. We have to know that we can win. If I say nothing else this evening, just know that we can win, and know that I have seen throughout history that organized people beat organized money every single time.
Catherine, do you have anything to add on building a movement? Maybe drawing from your work, building a movement on sanitation issues?
Yes, I think, what I've learned from this experience, first of all, I grew up with parents who were activists. And my parents were part of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was the original Black Panther Party that organized around voting rights in Lowndes County, Alabama. But I also have learned throughout this time is that we have to have those hard conversations with people that may not be our allies, and we may not be able to convince everybody, but we may walk out of the room with one or two more than we had before. And I think that's important to have those conversations. I think it's also important that, as Reverend Yearwood has said, is that we have to do the storytelling. The way I've been able to expand this fight, it hasn't been one woman's fight, it's been one woman and all these other women in Lowndes County who have been able to open their homes and tell their stories so people can see what it looks like to not have adequate sanitation. So I think it's going to be very important for us to pass the megaphone sometimes to those people that are in the community suffering from climate justice issues, suffering from environmental justice issues, and lift up those stories. We haven't told enough of those. I think one of the things that moved me to action was seeing An Inconvenient Truth a long time ago. But it's time for us to also tell the stories of people that are running from fires, the people that are opening up their, trying to get water out of their faucets and nothing is coming out, or the people like the people that we just celebrated getting $150 million in Mount Vernon, New York. What I knew about Mount Vernon before, I think my brother called it money earning Mount Vernon. And when I went to Mount Vernon, I can tell how old people are based on whether or not they responded to that. But anyway, that's part of hip hop history. But anyway, going there and seeing a victory occur because people lifted up their voices and told the stories. So we're going to have to continue to do those kinds of things to build a broader movement. And now I'm hearing from people having sanitation issues around the world. Somebody sent me pictures from Ghana where they have something there called suck-outs, that when they flush their toilets, it just goes into a trench. Or people from Nigeria who reached out to me, one young man who was working with me, through a human rights program at Columbia, talked about how he went to clerk for a judge in Lagos and had to move out of the apartment because of sewage running back into the home. And he talked about how they had sewage lagoons there. They have sewage lagoons in Lowndes County too. So building these broader movements around climate and environmental justice, I think is what's going to get us closer to justice a lot sooner.
Yeah. Well, Xiye, I want to ask you just maybe pick up on the storytelling bit. I know that's a focus for you, and it came up before. How do you build movements using storytelling?
Well, I'll build upon what Reverend Yearwood mentioned, which is the power of media, because the stories are there. The media and the communicators of those stories are not doing their job. So, an example is when we have hashtags or themes for strikes, The ones that go very popular and the media picks up on them are listen to the science, strike with us. You've probably even heard them before. But when our hashtags are protect defenders, or when they are people over profit, they don't report those headlines, those themes. And so it is about using also the people who we know, who have connections, who can pull strings, to pull all of those for the movement. Because if you think about all of the money, all of the knowledge, all of the communication that goes into perpetuating fossil fuel, like climate denialism, and all of the resources that go into lobbying and upholding the fossil fuel industry, it is nothing compared to what is going on in the storytelling side of climate justice, because we are just rooting ourselves in our words, and we're not relying on other people to push us through. And it is about passing the microphone to other people, but it is also about owning our space and knowing that it is our time to speak up. It is our time to be heard. It is our time to take those microphones. And when you have a story to tell, especially a climate story that is rooted in injustice, that story needs to be heard even more, because people are not, have not been exposed to this type of things. And I'll just close this by also building on what Reverend Yearwood said on movements, which is no movement has ever succeeded by thinking that it won't.
That's right.
Every single movement has succeeded because they saw through.
That's right.
And our movement is not a hope, our movement is a goal, because a goal has actionable steps, and that is what we're following.
Well, we have just a minute, so I just want to close and ask, and this is something that probably came up in some ways before, but to ask what success looks like to each of you, and just, if you can give us one or two sentences, and start with you, Catherine.
Well, success to me looks like my grandson not having to fight the same battles I've been fighting all these years.
Yeah.
And that we can leave a world that would benefit 7 generations to come.
For me, success looks like joy, because I think that all of our fights are for a world where we don't have to fight anymore, and what's possible when we don't fight is joy. So I'm just protecting the joy of future generations, and also opening up space for joy within the movement now.
Success for me is simply, I guess, Dr. King in the last century talked about equality, and he talked about one day, his children could play with the white children and how they could go different places. And he said he had a dream that they would be able to connect and be judged by your content and not the color of your skin. That was the 20th century when they were fighting for equality. And he ended his speech, obviously, saying, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Well, while we're still fighting for equality, in the 21st century, we are now fighting for existence. Mm-hmm. And my future and my hope is that we can come together, black, white, brown, red, male, female, queer, straight, gay, atheist, theist, humans. We can come together. And then one day when we win and we beat the fossil fuel industry, then we're going to stand up and say, fossil free at last. Fossil free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are fossil free at last.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Yearwood, Xiye Bastida, and Catherine Coleman Flowers. Great note to end this session on.
Thank you.
That concludes this evening's plenary. If you haven't already, please download the Aspen Ideas app for agenda updates. Thanks for participating in this evening's session.